About 10 years ago, I finally bought what I consider my dream home. The house itself was nice, sure, but the real reason I fell in love with the property was the land that came with it. Right behind the house sat a stunning private lake. The water was crystal clear, peaceful, and surrounded by trees. According to property lines, the lake was split right down the middle between my land and my neighbor's. My neighbor at the time was an older gentleman named Arthur. He had lived there for years, and from the moment I moved in, we got along great. We came to a simple gentleman's agreement about the lake. Arthur could fish anywhere, even on my side, and I could swim or paddle on his side whenever I wanted. Neither of us cared much about where the property line ran across the water. We just respected each other and took pride in keeping the lake clean and beautiful. For a long time, everything was perfect. Well, almost perfect. Technically, the neighborhood was part of Homeowners Association, an HOA. For years, they were more of a mild irritation than anything serious. Every once in a while, I'd get a letter complaining about the length of my grass or reminding me to hide my trash cans from the street. I paid the fees, followed the basic rules, and mostly ignored them. Then one year, everything changed. Arthur passed away. His family eventually sold his property, and the new buyer wasn't a family or another neighbor. Instead, it was an investment company. Even worse, someone from that company also happened to sit on the HOA board. That's when the trouble started. A few months after the sale, I received a notice about a special HOA meeting. The agenda simply said, Community Improvement Project. I was curious, so I decided to attend. When I arrived, the HOA president, a smug guy named Greg, stood up in front of everyone with a huge grin on his face. He rolled out a big presentation board and started describing their newest idea. The HOA planned to build a luxury floating restaurant right on the lake. My lake. I nearly fell out of my chair. I stood up immediately and said, "Excuse me, but half of that lake is my private property. You can't just build a restaurant on it." Greg didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, he looked amused. He slowly lifted a thick binder and flipped through it before pointing to a page deep inside. According to him, HOA regulations allowed the community to develop any body of water connected to neighborhood property if it benefited the residents. He proudly tapped an obscure clause buried somewhere around page 287. I protested again. My property deed clearly stated that I owned half of the lake bed. This wasn't some shared neighborhood pond. It was a private lake. Greg and several board members actually laughed. They claimed their lawyers had already reviewed everything and assured them they were completely within their rights. Then they called for a vote. It wasn't even close. Most of the residents didn't live anywhere near the lake, so of course they loved the idea of a fancy waterfront restaurant. To them, it sounded exciting. To me, it felt like they were stealing my property. Within a week, construction began. Huge barges floated in from Arthur's old side of the lake. Crews started assembling a massive floating platform right in the middle of the water. The noise was constant. Engines, metal clanging, workers shouting. I immediately contacted my lawyer. He carefully reviewed both my deed and the HOA documents. Unfortunately, the news wasn't very encouraging. The HOA clause they were using was written in vague language. Challenging it in court could take years and cost a fortune, with no guaranteed outcome. They've got deep pockets. My lawyer told me, "You're one homeowner fighting an entire association." He explained that the best chance I had was proving that my ownership of the lake was absolute and that their interpretation of the rules didn't apply. But building that case would take time. Meanwhile, construction continued. For the next 6 months, my life became miserable. From sunrise to sunset, there was constant noise. Workers wandered around the shoreline. The water that used to be perfectly clear turned cloudy with mud and debris. It felt like strangers had invaded the peaceful place I loved most about my home. I sent formal cease and desist letters. They ignored them. I even called the police once when workers crossed onto my side of the lake. But since the HOA claimed they had development rights, the officers said it was a civil dispute and there wasn't much they could do. The HOA board members acted smug about the whole situation. Sometimes they would wave at me from the construction site with these condescending smiles. Greg would occasionally shout across the water, Looks great, doesn't it? Think of how much this will raise your property value. I was furious, but legally I felt stuck. While the legal process dragged along painfully slow, the restaurant kept growing. Eventually, it turned into a massive 2-story structure floating on the lake. It had huge panoramic windows and a giant flashy sign that read the Lakeside Grill. To me, it looked ridiculous. The HOA proudly scheduled a huge grand opening event. Local politicians and reporters were invited. They clearly expected it to be their big moment of success. They were incredibly confident, but they had overlooked one very important detail. Years earlier, Arthur and I had talked about something most people didn't know about the lake. You see, the lake wasn't completely natural. It was fed by a spring, yes, but the water level was actually controlled by a man-made earthen dam located at the far end of my property. Hidden inside that dam was an old metal sluice gate built over 100 years ago by the farmer who originally created the lake to irrigate his fields. The structure was ancient, rusty, and completely hidden behind overgrown bushes, but it still worked. The large control wheel that operated the gate sat on my property behind an old stone shed. It was never included in modern surveys or property maps, which meant the HOA had absolutely no idea it existed. Only Arthur and I knew. About a week before the grand opening, I walked back to the dam. After spraying the mechanism with plenty of WD-40 and putting some effort into it, I finally managed to turn the massive iron wheel. At first it groaned and resisted, but eventually it began to move. I opened the gate just a tiny bit, not enough for anyone to notice immediately, but enough to let a steady trickle of water drain out through an old irrigation ditch that eventually flowed into a creek about a mile away. Over the next several days, I kept watching. The lake level slowly dropped, just an inch or two per day, so gradual that no one noticed unless they were paying close attention. Meanwhile, the restaurant had already been anchored to the lake bed with massive supports. Workers were busy adding finishing touches, arranging tables, stocking the bar, and preparing for the big opening. The confidence they showed was unbelievable. The day before the grand opening, I returned to the dam one more time. This time I brought a 3-foot pipe wrench for extra leverage. I put all my weight into it and cranked that will open as far as it would go. The roar of rushing water sounded like music to my ears. That night, I went to bed feeling calmer than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up to shouting outside. I calmly made a cup of coffee and stepped onto my back porch. The sight in front of me was beautiful. The Lakeside Grill was no longer floating. Instead, it sat crooked in about a foot of water and several feet of thick, smelly mud. The entire building leaned at a ridiculous angle, and its panoramic windows now looked out across an empty, muddy lake bed. Even the expensive construction barges were stranded in the muck. Across the bank stood Greg and several HOA board members, staring in horror. When Greg spotted me calmly sipping coffee, he started screaming, "What did you do? This is your fault." I took another slow sip and shrugged. "Did what, Greg?" "Looks like your community project ran into a little problem." He started ranting about how I had destroyed their property. I simply shrugged again. "My property?" I replied. "I thought you said this was a community lake." Then I calmly explained that I had simply performed routine maintenance on my land by draining some water from my half of the lake, something I was fully entitled to do. The aftermath was incredible. The grand opening was canceled immediately. The local news crews who arrived expecting to cover a glamorous restaurant launch instead broadcast footage of a giant half-sunken building stuck in the mud. Environmental authorities fined the HOA for damaging the lake bed and causing contamination. Investors pulled out, and the HOA was left owning a multi-million-dollar building that was completely useless. Their lawyers sent me threatening letters, of course, but my lawyer just laughed. I hadn't broken any laws. I had simply adjusted the water level on my own property. They couldn't force me to refill the lake. They eventually tried suing me, but the judge dismissed the case. He basically said they had built their entire project on something they didn't control. The ruined restaurant sat there for over a year, slowly rotting in the mud. Eventually, the HOA had to spend a fortune dismantling it piece by piece and hauling everything away. The disaster nearly bankrupted the association. Greg was forced to resign and eventually moved away in disgrace. A new board was elected soon after, and their first decision was to officially recognize my ownership rights to the lake and issue a formal apology. Eventually, I allowed the spring to refill the lake. Today, it's crystal clear again, just like it used to be. Sometimes I sit on my porch and look out over the water, remembering that crooked restaurant sinking into the mud. They thought they could bully me and take something that belonged to me. Instead, they learned a very expensive lesson. Sometimes the smallest overlooked detail can drain an entire grand plan. And honestly, that feels pretty good.